All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Shawnikan. For those of you who don't know, I am a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and this is our Race and the American Story Symposium. Let me turn this down so we don't hear those funny noises. Okay, so this is our symposium that turned into a Zoom-posium when things got a little bit out of hand with the virus. Previously, a number of us faculty who teach this course called Race and the American Story had planned to meet in Memphis over spring break. Well, it would have been spring break for us. And we were hoping to continue our conversations that had been started in our class on the rather wide topic of race and the American story. I'll give you a little bit of a background about how that program started. But since we are not able to go to the symposium because we had to cancel all the flights, all the hotel rooms, everything, we decided to switch to this format, and hopefully this format will serve us well. So for the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the theme of race and the American story through the particular focus on Thomas Jefferson, which is actually where all our students start in this class. We start with the Declaration of Independence and we go all the way to the 21st century. So quick notes on protocols for Zoom. If you'd like to see a much wider, a bigger sense of who's in the room, we're up to 47 people right now. But if you go up to your top right corner, you'll see something that says gallery view. And that way you can see more people on the screen at a particular time. So use your gallery view. Again, please mute if you're not speaking. And then there's a way that you can actually put your hand up when we get to that point in the session where we are going to invite questions. And to do that, you simply go down to where it's to the bottom of your Zoom screen. It says participants. All the participants will be listed on the right of your screen, and down below you can click on hands up or hands down, and we'll see that those hands go up and be able to call on you when the time comes. I'll introduce my co-collaborator on this project, Adam Seagrave. Adam, just wave real quick. Yes, Adam and I were both at the University of Missouri when we decided to start this project. Right now, we've both moved on to other campuses. I am at the University of Massachusetts, and Adam is at Arizona State University. I'm trying to close this, okay. I want to say thank you to Susan Kells and Joseph Martin, who really helped us to put this together. Joe, as we call him, worked really hard on our website, which is raceandtheamericanstory.org. And Susan has been working very hard, laboring to get us up on Zoom, and she's been our partner on this program since we resumed this year. So Susan, wave real quick, because she's the administrator. She's the queen of all things. And then I want to bring your attention also to one of my grad students is on here. Yelena Sims is somewhere on the screen. Lena is my graduate student, and she manages our Twitter account. So if you'd like to follow us on Twitter, she's waving. Lovely hair, Lena. Lena will be live tweeting from our Twitter account, which is race_Amer_story. And so you can also follow us on that platform. So how did we start this? In 2015, we had a major event at the University of Missouri, and our students really wanted to bring attention to the problems that they were experiencing on campus that related to race and racism. At the time, they were thinking about, they were inundated with lots of videos about of young Black people being killed. The Black Lives Matter movement was on the rise. We had Mike Brown murdered in St. Louis, which is just down the road from the University of Missouri. And so students were really at that time, at that moment, very, very tense. And this was a result of quite a number of events that happened off campus and then also on campus. And so we had a wonderful group of students really create a movement to bring attention to what was going on. And so as a result of that movement, I won't go into details. You can easily Google it and see all the drama that went on, but as a result of the very good work that the students did, we had a lot of changes at the University of Missouri campus. Among them, we created a program called Citizenship at Mizzou, which all incoming students had to take. That was a 2-hour program that was successful because as an ethnomusicologist, I use music to engage questions that may be a little bit difficult. And so we used music, we worked with students, and that became a program that I'm really still very proud of. But 2 hours is not enough to really orient students to the, or human beings, anybody, to the sort of realities of race and racism and the history and the context. And so at the time, Adam Seagrave was a professor in political science and the Kinder Institute for Constitutional Democracy at University of Missouri. Adam was also an affiliate of the Department of Black Studies, where I was chair. And Adam approached me with the idea to create an extended version of Citizenship at Mizzou. What if we created a course where students could actually sit down and think about race and racism through the context of some primary documents from American history? And so Adam and I started to talk about this. We created a 1-credit course, invited some of our colleagues to join us in creating it. So April Langley is on the line. I see her there with her beautiful long plaits. And Rudy is there too. I see Rudy also has really helped us shape this course. And so now we teach this course on 3 different campuses: University of Missouri, University of Massachusetts, and Arizona State University. And our intention is always, every year, to bring our students together at a symposium where they could really grapple with understanding what Thomas Jefferson and the other founding fathers meant by certain phrases in the founding documents, to grapple with King and Malcolm X, to think about Booker T. Washington, Tocqueville. We have a pretty comprehensive syllabus that we all use and we all draw from. And so each year at the symposium, we invite a major scholar, and this time a pair of scholars, to really help us think about these topics that are so problematic and enduring. So last year we had Ibram Kendi join us. This year we were so excited that Annette Gordon-Reed and Peter Onuf could join us, since we are talking about Thomas Jefferson at the beginning of this course, and since we are also reading their book, and Adam will talk a little bit more about that. And so we're happy to have both Annette and Peter join us this afternoon. Adam will talk a little bit more about the plan for the 90 minutes, but I do want to say that at the end of the session, please give us some feedback, because a lot of what we do through grants and support from our universities. And so we'd love to give them some feedback about how we've used this platform to continue our conversation. And so feedback will, if you could send that as an email to raceandtheamericanstory@gmail.com. We'll put it up on the chat thing, and you can please send us feedback. So I'm going to toss it over to my buddy Adam. Adam, you'll talk a little bit about how we'll spend the rest of our 90 minutes, and you'll introduce our two speakers.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie, and I'm so happy to see you all here, and I'm just really humbled to be working on this project with our other faculty and with Stephanie, and especially today to have Annette Gordon-Reed and Peter Onuf joining us. We'll introduce here in a minute. As Stephanie mentioned, the plan will be for us to go for about 90 minutes total. And we'll split that up into three rough parts of roughly equal length. The first part will consist of Stephanie and myself asking Annette and Peter a few questions and talking for a little while about our questions. And then we'll turn it over to student questions. The students in the course and other students who are here will have an opportunity to ask some questions. And then after that point, for the last 30 minutes or so, we'll turn it over to general audience questions for our guests. So that's the basic plan for the rest of our time together today. So now, as I said, it's my privilege and honor to introduce our distinguished guests. Annette Gordon-Reed is the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School, and a professor of history in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. Gordon-Reed has won many book prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2009 and the National Book Award in 2008 for the Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family. Among her many other notable works are Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, Vernon Can Read, a memoir, a collaboration with Vernon Jordan, and Race on Trial, Law and Justice in American History. A selected list of her honors include a fellowship from the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, a Guggenheim Fellowship in the Humanities, a MacArthur Fellowship, the National Humanities Medal, the National Book Award, the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, the George Washington Book Prize, and the Anisfield Wolf Book Award. Gordon-Reed was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2011, and is a member of the Academy's Commission on the Humanities and Social Sciences. In 2019, she was elected as a member of the American Philosophical Society. Peter S. Onuf is the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Professor Emeritus in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia, and Senior Research Fellow at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. Onuf's work on Thomas Jefferson's political thoughts, culminating in Jefferson's Empire, the Language of American Nationhood, and The Mind of Thomas Jefferson, grows out of earlier studies on the history of American federalism, foreign policy, and political economy. His most recent book, Jefferson and the Virginians, Democracy, Constitutions, and Empire, was published in 2018 by Louisiana State University Press. With Ed Ayers and Brian Ballo, Onuf was also founding co-host of the public radio program Backstory with the American History Guys. In 2014, Onuf was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And now both professors, Gordon-Reed and Onuf, are co-authors of this book, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination, which we've recently read in our course, the Race and the American Story course, with all of our students, and recently discussed with all of our students. So this book and their work on Thomas Jefferson will be the focus of much of our discussion today. So thank you both so much for joining us. We're really honored to have you here and looking forward to a great conversation. All right.
Nice to be here.
Good to be here. Yes.
Thank you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Stephanie to get us started.
All right. Annette and Peter, I'll ask you a question about process first, because today I had a whole session with a number of our students, undergraduates and graduate students, who are working on topics for their final paper. And they are at the point of thinking about what that topic is. They're at the point of thinking about how they will introduce something new to the conversation or to the scholarship. So we definitely want to get into content with both of you, but I thought it would be nice to just start with a question about process. Both of you are so, you know, you've written so much on your own, and then you come together and you write this book that has, that's on the bestseller list. So could you talk to us, both of you, from your various perspective, what it was like to collaborate on this book, The Most Blessed of Patriarchs, and what was it like working with each other? So we'll just start with a process question.
Do you want to start?
You want to start?
Well,
this
is what it was like. This is
She's
exactly
always supposed to be sitting on my left.
Pretend that I'm on your left. Well, I think this really started a long time ago. We've known each other a long time, 1995, and we've been in a sort of a constant conversation, debate, conversation about Jefferson since that time period. And we kind of fell into doing this book because I think we thought it would be a good idea to put down some of our conversation on paper. You know, that was the sort of impetus for it. I actually have a contract to write a biography of Jefferson, and a sort of full-scale biography of Jefferson. And this would be a way for me to think about him in a different way than I've typically thought of him. Jefferson has sort of occupied my time thinking about him as a slave owner, a politician, the political side of Jefferson, but also life at Monticello. Peter has been engaged in thinking about the intellectual life of Thomas Jefferson. And so this was a way for me to learn some things about that, to think about them in a different kind of way. So that's part of how we got that. What do you think, Peter?
Well, I'll give you the real reason. Annette intimates this. Writing this book was a chapter in our friendship. That's what inspired it. But there's another ulterior motive on Annette's part. And she thought, because I am so old, I self-describe as a nearly dead white guy, that I would go out to pasture and not do anything anymore because I was about to retire. And so this was extending a helping hand across the generations, or the half generation, to keep me busy, to keep me occupied, and to have a good time talking about Jefferson. I don't mean to trivialize this by being funny, because I speak from the heart when I say this is all about our friendship. And Jefferson is such an interesting character. I think our working premise for both of us was that we were not satisfied with stereotypical characterizations of Jefferson, loving him too much or hating him too much. Both of them occlude a proper understanding of the man himself. And I would say, this sounds maybe a little too much, but exploring Jefferson for me throughout my career, and especially with Annette, has been a kind of self-discovery, trying to achieve a better understanding of the world that we live in, both vicariously, the 18th and 19th century world, but the ways that that world connects to the one we sort of live in now. I'm not sure what the accurate term is for what we're doing in it. But I did wear my mask at the market just an hour ago.
Well, that's good to hear. No, that's it. You know, the idea of exploring a person, because we say it in the book, and if you've read it, that this idea of loving him or hating him, the idea of not taking him at his word, basically not thinking that anything he said was serious, he becomes just this story where the person who's writing about him or thinking about him is really talking about themselves. I suppose in some way we're always doing that, but really these are the things that are interesting to me. These are the things, the grievances that I have. These are on the other side, these are the things that I admire, and I'm going to make him everything that I admire, instead of trying to figure out what did this human being who was in this particular moment, how did he make sense of the world, and how did he become a person that we're sitting here in 2020 talking about him on this new medium. I mean, it's a pretty astonishing thing to actually to have a legacy, to have that kind of force in the world that after all these years, we're still talking about him. Many people have come and gone. There've been other presidents, and there are other presidents who've done consequential things, other people who've done consequential things, and it's not quite the same. And I think it's because of this, we're going to be talking about race and slavery and all of those kinds of things that are still problems for us, that he becomes a way of talking about these things.
I'd like to add, and we'll let you ask a question eventually, but I'd like to add now that, and that's wonderful work on the Hemingses, is, I think, and I've described it in this way, an oblique biography of Jefferson, which is another way of saying that the Hemingses, of course, they have a history of their own. They deserve the kind of treatment they got, and only Annette could possibly give them, for them to have their moment of attention and our historical attention. But in looking at them, looking at the people who did not count, looking at the people who were property, looking at the people who don't figure in the master narrative, and I use that word master advisedly, we don't understand the story we think we're telling ourselves about America. You have to understand that Jefferson's biography is also the biography of the people around him. It's that connection between Jefferson and even those people who were his property, and assessing what kind of relationship was it. We could so simply dismiss it in Hegelian terms. It's the master and the slave. Make it into that classic binary, but it's binaries is precisely what we want to transcend, to get a better feeling for who Jefferson was and then who everybody is.
Right. Yeah. Right. So Adam is transitioning to context, but I did want to mention that, I think at this moment in 2020, when we're all at home in our rooms and when we're all so isolated, this is a wonderful time to sort of stop and be still, right? And think about these things, these sound bites that have captured the imagination of so many people across the world in terms of who Jefferson is. I also think that this is a great moment, because I didn't acknowledge this at the beginning of our session, as we sit in our homes as well because of this virus, to think about what collaboration looks like, right? Adam and I hope to be following in your footsteps. We're working on a book now.
Cool.
Wow. Yes. And some of our students are working on some wonderful projects too. And so it's just nice to hear about how friendships develop in academia, how those friendships can result in a work such as the one we're talking about now. So you've already started to talk about content, and I'll throw it over to Adam to carry that on.
Yeah, thanks. This discussion and your answers to Stephanie's questions really lead well into the question that I was going to ask next, because it has to do with the idea of humanizing Jefferson, right? And thinking about his humanity, and we're thinking about how, it's so easy to treat historical figures as caricatures in various ways, or stereotypes, and in one-sided ways. And that's been particularly the case with Jefferson, I think. It's difficult to treat him in a well-rounded way, and your treatment, I think, in the book really was noteworthy for that it gave a complex, well-rounded depiction of Jefferson and humanized him in that way, in the sense of showing who the human being was. And I think that was really important. So my question is, what were some of the parts of Jefferson's story in particular, or in general, the parts of Jefferson's story that you thought were really important to bring to light to give this more balanced picture of Jefferson that you give in the book?
Well, there are a number of things that first I would like to say too, that humanizing Jefferson is important. I'm piggybacking on what Peter said before. It's not just important for him, but it's important, again, for the people around you, because you don't know how enslaved people, what they thought, try to get at what they thought, what they were feeling, the decisions they made, how they went through the world, if he is something other than a person. Do you know what I mean? They were people who were not treated as people, but were people who were dealing with other people, and not to make them into gods, not to make them into, anything supernatural. So that the purpose of humanizing him was to get a better grasp on a subject, but again, always to see him within the context of all of the people around him. One of the things that I thought we did, and I'd like to do more of and extend this more because it made me think so much more about his situation, was to highlight his connection to his wife. That is typically told as a story of pretty much just the two of them. He meets this wealthy widow and marries her, and they're deeply in love, and they're 10 years, as he said, of uncheckered happiness and blah, 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 blah. But, she comes to the marriage with these 6 half siblings who are of mixed race and are enslaved. Now, we'll never really know how they felt about each other, how this happened, but the things you notice, the circumstances you notice, he immediately takes them and they're brought in to be around them, the couple, all the time. Robert at 12 becomes his valet. He substitutes a man who is his age, Jupiter Evans, for a 12-year-old, his wife's half brother, and they travel around the Eastern Seaboard together. The women are brought into the house, or they weren't never out of the house, but they are at Monticello. They are around Martha all the time. These are her half siblings who are enslaved. And so you think about this, obviously meant something to Jefferson because he treats them very differently from the other people on the at Monticello. So blood and family is a connection, but race and status divide them. But still, there's something there that means they are different. The guys go off and hire their time and keep the money. The women only do things that other women do, like cooking and sewing, not even cooking, but really sewing and that kind of, and look at minding children and so forth. So how does that affect them? How does it affect the Hemings family to be treated that way, and other people are treated, or don't have the kinds of connections and freedoms and so forth that they do? Not real freedom, but something different. So that, talking about that relationship, bringing that relationship out, when typically in most Jefferson biographies, Robert Hemings is described as Jefferson's servant. Or even if he's described as enslaved, he's actually Jefferson's wife's half brother. There's a connection to them that is more weird than the fact that, or as weird as the fact that he's enslaved. And so that, to my mind, was a way of bringing out Jefferson's humanity and humanity in the people around him as well.
And I would add that humanizing requires an attention to the different contexts within which human relations take place. Mm-hmm. And I would add to your question, Adam, that we need to historicize as well as humanize. That is, we can't transport ourselves into Monticello and take with us our understandings of the way families work and begin to understand that larger family. We chose a title, The Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, focus on what seemed so alien and foreign about the Jefferson that we've reconstructed, mostly in the homes he lived in. And that notion of a patriarch. It's supposed to be the iconic Democrat who is imagining us, who's fashioning himself into a citizen and a model for American citizens ever after, that kind of connection we have with him. But to enter that house is to enter a different world. We can understand it, but we have to look at different things and try to understand them. First, very simple thing is that a home is not a household. Home, that effective notion of domesticity that Jefferson in some ways is a precocious pioneer of developing this kind of sentimental notion of the romance of the family, of the nuclear family. And he adores his grandchildren and so forth. But that home, that mythical place, is embedded in a household. And it's a household that exists for reasons that go far beyond Jefferson's self-actualization or collecting things or building a library or living the life of an enlightened man of reason. But trying to create those contexts is, I think, really a challenge. One that was a challenge for me because I'm completely ignorant, and I know Annette understands all this a lot better, but for some reason, I began writing the chapter about music. What do I know? She's now recovering her lost childhood of playing music. I never could even whistle or bubble gum or any of those things, those basic skills of life. But thinking about how music worked, who it included, and how inclusion in music making would reflect Jefferson's values, that for me was great fun. It was an eye-opener. As I say, Jefferson is really interesting, and follow him a little bit. What does it mean to make music together? It's a sort of a stylized conversation, harmonious. Now, we're pretty harmonious so far, and I always get along with Annette, but I could imagine this degenerating into a big fight if we really, no, I'm joking. There are lots of things to talk about, particularly when we talk about race and slavery. Jefferson wants to control. We associate him with freedom, with liberation, but the other side of freedom and liberation is order, is finding a way to impose an order. He's trying to teach and practice a new kind of civility, to foster the kinds of conversations which are, like this one today, reciprocally enriching, to get beyond the kind of petty competition and conflict of the imposition of self on others. And he was remarkable, but he was also remarkable in making music that he didn't hear the music that was being made by other people. Or he pretended not to hear it. That is the music made by enslaved people.
Yes, and his daughter remembered all of the songs that she had been taught as a child by African Americans,
Right.
but that is not a part, but she too was of a different generation. His generation of people did not, that's one of the things that you have to also think about with Jefferson, is that he's a man of the 18th century, and the slavery of that time was different from the slavery that came later. And this was not an era when people sentimentalized enslaved people. By the antebellum period, as I'm sure you all know, it was a story about family and how we all love our people and all that kind of stuff. That was not a part of his thing. And so you don't have any sense of him sentimentalizing African-American people in the way that later on apologists for slavery actually tried to do.
Yeah, okay, so all interesting, particularly the fact that Peter cannot whistle. That blows my mind.
We got to work on that.
Okay, we'll give him lessons. But I think what you're both saying speaks to the next part of our questioning, which is that this is such a complicated man, you know, yes, of another generation, of another time. And it's important to see him in that time, at that period. So I have a question for Annette. Annette, what was it like? I'd like to sort of take you out of the most blessed of patriarchs back to Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, an American controversy, which got you the Pulitzer Prize, very well deserved. What got you there? Like, what was it that gave you the sort of the audacity to take on this beloved, in many senses, or by many people, this icon of American history? How were you able to get the bravery to take this on, and how did that inform? Because I've heard you speak about it, and I've heard you speak about the sort of flack that you got for doing so. So for the students in the room, and for many of us, we are eternal students. How do you take on that kind of topic that will be so difficult to get through because of the way he's been preserved in our minds?
Well, I should say that I think it was the right time to do it. He had been softened up enough by a lot of people by the time I got to it. But I guess what I would say is that I was a law professor and I wasn't in the historical profession. And I guess you could say I didn't know enough to be frightened about the possibility of doing this, because this is what law professors do. I mean, to our credit and to our, criticize us, we think we know everything. And we can become experts on everything. And, so, I mean, I really did not think about the fact that this was an odd thing to do. I got into it because I was very, very upset about the way people were writing about the story. And I've said this before, talking about the movie Jefferson in Paris. There were historians who were saying there's no evidence that this ever happened. Jefferson in Paris, if anybody, maybe the 1% of you who have seen this, treats the story of Jefferson and Hemings as if it were true. And there were lots of people who were outraged by that. And they were saying things, Jefferson would never be involved with a slave girl. There's no evidence that this happened. And I knew that there was evidence that it happened. Whether it was proof, the evidence that I knew about, whether that amounted to proof or not was a separate question. But to say that it was no evidence was like saying that what Madison Hemings had to say and what Israel Gillette had to say about this, that it didn't matter. It was nothing. And it just struck me as morality stood on its head, that people who were enslaved were not listened to about what happened to them in slavery, and all the historians were doing was trying to protect Jefferson, sort of playing along with the rules. Some years after the same year, I guess I should say, my first book came out, I gave a talk at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and a Jefferson descendant came up to me afterwards, the descendant from his wife, came up to me afterwards and told me that when he was a little boy, he asked his grandfather, grandfather, whether or not this story about Sally Hemings was true. And his grandfather said, of course it's true, but they will never prove it. And I kind of laughed and I thought, oh, that's sort of interesting. And then on my way back to Logan Airport, I thought, it's not really funny, because what it was is that these people in this particular class believed that they would be protected, even down into history, because their word would be taken by historians as truthful. And whatever Madison Hemings or any of these other people out in Chillicothe, Ohio had to say about their ancestry would not be listened to, because these people had law. They were the children of marriages. And so obviously 100% biologically certain that those kids belonged to, to the husband, which is, not true. And outside of law, being outside of law as these children and being of a different race meant that their words would not mean anything. And so the sort of collective privilege of being able to control people in your society. And then because you have law propping you up, historians look at that law and feel that truth is contained within the boundaries of that. And so it was really my outrage about the different treatment, the way that they were not looking at evidence in a fair way. And yet they were very often talking about law, resorting to law, saying the sort of terminology of law. If this were a trial, they were talking about burdens of proof and evidence and all of those things. And they didn't know what they were talking about, really. Or they had a particular way of talking about it that I wanted desperately to try to explode. So it was not just about Tom and Sally, as whether they had kids together. It was about, no, this is wrong. The way you're talking about this is outrageous. I mean, there's plenty of evidence for this, and the people you're listening to at saying that it didn't happen are saying things that are not true, and you're not telling anybody that. You're not letting that inform the way you write. And I saw it as a moral problem. And so that's why I decided to do it. And it's being as outside of the profession and not really, not having any allegiances in any kind of way, I was able to do it without even thinking about the fact that, this would not have been the thing to do if I had been, say, an assistant professor in a history department somewhere.
Well, I want to add just a footnote to this, and that is, I was supposed to be a bad guy because I was the Jefferson professor at Virginia, and Annette, being a brave lawyer, who said, I'm just going to do this, but she said, I want to find out what kind of response I'm going to get. And metaphorically and in fact, the door was swinging open for her. I read the draft of her book, and I was persuaded. We were ready. She mentioned that softening, that the time was right within the history profession.
Yeah,
this was a wave of civil rights history, of the rediscovery of slavery as a central issue in American history, race, with wonderful work by Winthrop Jordan and many other writers, was front and center. And Annette was waiting to happen. We should have invented her, but happily she came along all by herself and brought the good news. Doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of resistance. It doesn't mean that she didn't have something to teach us beyond that relationship between Jefferson and Hemings. One of the things that was sobering about this for historians is that they had been deferring too much to the authorities. They'd been deferring too much to Dumas Malone and Merrill Peterson, the great Jefferson biographers, the custodian of the Jefferson tradition, and excellent historians. This is not to denigrate them, but that preemptively closed mind, that focus on the man on the mountain who's above everything else. There was indeed genuine resistance, and that was a struggle. Within the profession, though, I have to say, I think she was happily disappointed.
Yeah. Well, I think there's something about the founders, all of this transformation in the historiography, slavery historiography, had definitely taken place by then, but the pockets of resistance to sort of changing the life of somebody like Jefferson. And I have to say this as well. I think I've said this before, but I also think that to the extent that there was some resistance, and there was, I got these letters from people. I understand, I was told that the editor of a particular journal was asked if he'd read my first book when it was out, and he said, I haven't, and I'm never going to. And that was just sort of like blanket, not not going to be on board with all of this. I think a lot of it is that it's the package. I think the authority, when you talk about authority, Jefferson, founder, white guy, to have an African-American woman say, not so much about Jefferson, but to say, these guys don't know what they're talking about. I think perhaps rubbed some people the wrong way, whether they actually believed it or not.
Right.
It wasn't about whether it was true or not. It's just that we're not going to accept this from you. And I think for some people that was a part of it, because, you know, it isn't just about, not just about Jefferson, it's about the authority of the historical profession, and not the profession, but mainly Jefferson biographers, I would say, because the historians, I would say most people were neutral on this, or didn't think it was that important at all. But for the people who had been writing about Jefferson, for me to come along and say, you know, this guy who's been writing about him for 40 years doesn't know what he's talking about, was a pretty bitter pill for some people to swallow.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So, and following up on this question, you know, relating to Annette, how your previous work led up to this joint work on Jefferson. I think one of the things that made your joint work successful and compelling on Jefferson here is that you both came to it from different paths, right, and different scholarly expertise and backgrounds. And so I have a question for Peter relating to that, to your previous work and how it led up to this Jefferson, this particular book and joint work with Annette. So in most of your career, you focused on studying the earliest period of American history in transatlantic context, and leading up to your extensive work on Jefferson on your own prior to collaborating with Annette. So my question for you is you know, what did you, in particular, what did you learn about race and American history, or race in the American story, from that previous work on the earliest period of American history, the earliest chapter of the American story? And then secondarily, maybe also, could early Americans have anticipated the state of race relations today?
Could people in Jefferson's time have anticipated? Well, no, they got it all wrong. Well, let me answer the first part of your question first, Adam. It's a good one. And I would say I came at the problem of race and slavery obliquely. And that suggested that a lot of us didn't have a major stake in the paternity question. And to us, in fact, it seemed unimportant. It seems very important to me now, and that's a big flip. We were, in my generation, ready to begin thinking, and had begun thinking, about the ubiquity of slavery, its significance in American political economic development. That was all set. But for me, it was the combination of self-defense. When I got to Charlottesville, I had to focus on Jefferson for the first time explicitly. He'd been on my periphery. He moved to my center. I had to take him seriously. But when I came to Virginia, I had been thinking about federalism. Now, you might not think that's relevant, but under the influence of my brother, who's an international relations theorist with whom I've written a couple of books, I had been actively thinking about the United States as a federal system, a state system. And that was very important in my reading of the federal Constitution and the movement toward drafting the Constitution. But what it made me aware of were certain basic ideas about politics and about international relations. And the simple idea I had when I got to Virginia, and I developed in the period leading up to my collaboration with Annette, and I think it set the stage. While she was doing her wonderful work on the Hemingses, I was thinking about the problem of how Jefferson understood enslaved people in the context of international relations. That is, the idea of the captive nation, that slavery is a form of rule over an unwilling and alien people, that slavery is a state of war. These ideas were, in effect, imported for me almost automatically from work I'd been doing with my brother Nick on the law of nations in the Revolutionary period, transposing that idea of nation with Jefferson and other people who explicitly talked about it in these terms. And when you read the Notes in the State of Virginia with that idea of enslaved people as an unwilling captive nation, occupying a land that was not their own, and that Jefferson's idea of emancipation leading to expatriation is it follows naturally on that. And it also suggests, as state of war metaphors do suggest, the othering of the enemy, recognizing the danger of a foreign power, recognizing the danger that enslaved people could be a fifth column for counter-revolutionary forces, that is for the British in the period of the Revolution. I came at race then in the context and from the context of nation making, rather than beginning by studying race and moving out to the world within which racial slavery was practiced and was so crucially important. That may seem unimportant to you, but the way you come at a problem is, of course, going to have a major determination on how you understand that problem. And when I was thinking along these lines, typically for me, I don't do people. I'm a student of a famous historian who never studied people. It's always ideas and structures and big things happening. I came to race and slavery as I came to Jefferson simultaneously. And then when those things came together, then moving out from Jefferson, then as I tell people now in my field, I don't think we all need to study race and slavery. In fact, I think there are a lot of things that are understudied now because this is such a central topic for us, and quite rightly so. But what I do tell people is that everything you study has to be understood in the context of the importance of slavery for the regime, for the economy, for the society. If you're not aware of it, you're not getting it. So it's not, and I think that's the stage we want to reach. That is we want to make sense out of Jefferson. We have to know he's a slave owner. We have to understand his ideas about race. It's not that that's all we do, but it informs and should inform all we do.
And that's what I think makes it, if I can just jump in here to say, that makes the collaboration interesting, because these ideas about race and war, the state of war, all of those kinds of things. And we'll never know the answer to this. This is the maddening thing about it, is how does that affect a person who has children who are mixed race, whose wife has, and I really, after all these years, it just occurred to me sort of in the last year or so, thinking, he marries this, what must it have been like to have your neighbors know that your wife has these kids? This was something that was talked about. Wives have these siblings. And your attitude about race, how does that affect what you say about it? Are you trying to hide stuff? Are you trying to reassure people about your bona fides on this? How do people act in that kind of moment? We can't know this, but the understanding that this situation existed, it has to again inform the way you think about him, and to wonder about a person who had formulated this idea about the incapacity of Blacks and whites to live together, and live together, and there they all are. So that makes it much more, well, again, just a part of the sort of weird and fascinating aspect of his life.
And I think that's a way in. It doesn't reduce Jefferson. It doesn't get, now we know Jefferson. He's the slave owner. He's the master. He's a racist. Quite to the contrary. This is in no way do I mean to extenuate, forgive. But what I will say is Jefferson is a terribly complex person, as we all are, even as he's sorting out these problems of kinship and how they map on to race and the mixing of races. His fundamental loyalties, his sense of identity is in flux.
Mm-hmm.
He's an Anglo-American. He's a subject of King George III. He didn't grow gradually until age 32 and wake up and say, nah, I've had enough of being a subject. I want to be a citizen. All of this stuff is happening suddenly. And all of these ideas about what a nation is and what a race is, they're emerging at that same moment. So we don't understand any one of those things, any one of those changes, if we don't understand them together.
Yeah.
And Jefferson enables us to see how, and that's what Annette is suggesting here, I think quite beautifully, that is that the question then is, well, hey, what's it like? How are you actually dealing with all this stuff?
Yeah. I mean, and one of the mistakes that he made, and I put these in quotes, is that he writes all this stuff down. He's actually, this is the downside of being a visionary. He's thinking about things. People say, well, George Washington never said that kind of stuff, because George Washington is not thinking about this kind of stuff. He's not thinking about, what is this going to look like for the next 100 years or 200 years? How is this going to work? Are we going to have two classes of citizens here? White people and Black citizens? Can that work? Can you have, in a Republican society, can you have second-class citizens, first-class citizens? And he would have said no, right? No. That's not the way it's going to work. And so they can't be here because we're not gonna live with them as equals, right? Now, he doesn't think that's possible, but to the extent that other people, he's thinking about all these kinds of things, not just about, that. He's thinking about the crazy names of states. He's thinking about the grid. He's thinking about all kinds of things that he puts down on paper, and consequently to us looks ridiculous at this point. But these are the central questions. I mean, we're still talking about this now. I mean, we're acting as if this is a problem that we solved. Ha ha ha. Wasn't it crazy for him to think that this was going to be tough? And look at where we are at this moment.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think our students have a couple questions about how we bridge him from as a complex character at that time to now. So we're going to call on a couple of students to ask some questions, and then some of our colleagues who teach this course as well, and some of the other folks on the call. So let me call on Naomi, who is one of my students. Naomi, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
There she is. Okay, so Naomi, you want to introduce yourself and ask your question?
I'm Naomi. I'm a junior at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I am a double major, Afro-Am and early childhood education, and I am Black and Hispanic. Mm-hmm. So I had a question that I wanted to propose to you guys, and the question is, how do you think that Jefferson would think about the political climate today?
I'll start that, Annette. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, because that question is, what would Jefferson do today? What would he think? Well, we don't know, but I'll throw something out, and that is, our first reflex is to say, oh, he's Mr. Harmony. He wants everybody to get together. As Annette was suggesting, that idea of a virtuous citizenry, a certain homogeneity, can't imagine the kind of diversity that we take for granted. But I would say it's a little more complicated, because I think Jefferson himself, when he metaphorically invents the American people in the Declaration of Independence, by positing this community of like-minded citizens who are thinking the same thought and declaring the same thing at the same time, is the culmination of a period of political mobilization. And that political mobilization led to the emergence of a patriot party, which is only a minority of the American residents in what became the United States in 1776. And so he's speaking as a party leader, even in the revolution itself. And then Jefferson's political career subsequently culminates in his presidency after a period in the 1790s when he is the leader of a party. To think that Jefferson can be understood as somehow being above parties is a fundamental mistake. I don't know what he would make of us But I would describe the revolutionary period in this way. It's a period of many different mobilizations and counter-mobilizations, including the mobilization of enslaved people taking up arms against the revolution. We live in a period of multiple mobilizations leading to the prospect that the whole thing will fall apart. Of course, Jefferson would be deeply upset that all his work ends up in this. But he was deeply upset during the Missouri controversy when he thought the Union would split. And he wished himself dead. He would have been deeply upset during the Civil War, for which he bears major responsibility because of the problem of slavery, because of the way his ideas about federalism were appropriated by secessionists. I think Jefferson would owe himself and us an apology. Now, I'm being ridiculous now. But he could not say, if he looks at our world, oh, I don't recognize this. I think in many ways, the kinds of struggles that are going on are, we don't know how they're going to turn out. We don't believe that there's an emergent patriot coalition that's going to make a better America. He told himself that the outcome of all those wars would be the creation of an enduring republic. But the enduring republic only endures because of the mobilization of people, because of its politics. Those politics make us who we are, but those politics, of course, could destroy us today. I don't know if that's what you were expecting, Naomi, but that's my intentionally confusing answer.
Well, I would say, I mean, I think I agree with a lot of that. I do think that he would be surprised by their mobilizations, but they're mobilizations of lobbyists, mobilizations of small elites within society. I think he would probably be surprised at the extent to which we as citizens have sort of abdicated our responsibility to participate in the political process. Judges, I mean, he would be surprised how we depend so much upon rulings by judges, and without the proper kind of mobilization, because judges are appointed by political figures, it really depends on how people, who's in place, who wants to exercise power. So I think he would be disappointed, because I think he thought people were much more into politics than they actually are. He would have thought, I mean, you know, he was galvanized by politics, and he thought everybody would want to participate and everybody would, you know, be in there in the mix. And that's not, that hasn't, and I'm sure a lot of it has to do with voter suppression. You know, some people can't be in the mix. The people who want to be can't. But even when they have the freedom to do it, we're not as involved politically as I think he thought would be required in a society, in a republic. We're supposed to be in it, and so I think he would be disappointed by that. And certainly money, the way money as speech, corporations as people, that have transformed. I mean, since the time I was a kid, it's transformed the way politics work in this society. I think would probably, because they would think that was bribery. You know, I mean, that would have been considered bribery, and that's a huge part of our system.
I think a lot of the mobilizations are phony.
Yeah,
that's another way of saying
they're astroturf.
That's right, and they often invoke the great mobilizations that made America great. But it's a caricature of what an 18th century, early 19th century person would have thought it meant to be politically active as a citizen. Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Well, I think it's my turn now to pick on one of my students. Many here. So I'll. I know a number of them have prepared questions. Cormac, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. So my question actually has more to do with how Frederick was something that Frederick Douglass brought up with Thomas Jefferson, his legacy. Douglass, as you guys likely know, famously stated that the Declaration of Independence was the ring bolt of America's future. However, it is debatable whether Jefferson saw his document as the ring bolt for the future of female and non-white Americans. Based on your research, how did Jefferson see the Declaration pertaining to people of other races and genders?
Well, do you want to go with that, Peter?
Well, I'll offer a short answer, and Annette will get it right. And that is, Jefferson is imagining a people in the context of a war in which he sees people of different races and different colors as potential enemies or actual enemies. Mm-hmm. That's a radically reductive, simple way for him to think about the war. Many enslaved people became freed people who fought for the Patriots. Many Native Americans, the Oneida and others, were pro-American. It's a complex, messy, foggy situation, but Jefferson simplified it. So he means two things in the Declaration. One is he means this is our people at this moment, and this is how I describe it, and I don't see it being any different in the future. On the other hand, there is a notion of the universal purchase or reach of the natural rights claims he's making, of the basic axioms he's putting forth. And one way to reconcile the two Jeffersons, or those two ideas about who the American people are, or what it means to be a people, is to say that in his vision of the future, all nations, that is, distinct groups of people, will determine their own destiny. And that's his imagined outcome of his plan for emancipation and expatriation. Could he have thought about the mixture of races? I defer to Annette on this, because I think the answer really comes from deep in his personal experience. And it's why we need to know more about his personal experience and how he lives race. Mm-hmm. I am extremely skeptical that he would have been prepared under any foreseeable conditions, particularly as slavery became more pervasive and more prosperous and more powerful over the course of his late life, that he could have ever seen beyond the notion of a white America.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would have been tough for him. There's no question about it. But that's the difficulty with bringing these people forward, to our time, and to think about this moment. I mean, we are who we are. I don't say we, but most Americans are who they are, have come to this notion about race, or to the extent that it's enlightened by a lot of things that have happened over the years, the Holocaust, the Civil Rights Movement, all of those kinds of things. There are people, I grew up in a small town in Texas, very, very racist place. And I know people of certain generations who grew up a particular way, have a completely different understanding about life now than they had, that they came up with. So we don't really know. The answer is, Peter started out saying, we have no way of knowing, how people's minds could have been changed, or what people would think about things, given all that has happened since 1826, when he died, up until this particular moment. But I think Peter's right. He's thinking the Declaration is about the rights of a people, thinking about the future of a people. And he sees them as different people. I mean, the part of the Declaration that's excised, when he actually calls Africans men, and he's talking about, the horrors of the slave trade, the part that was excised, indicates that just because he doesn't think that that Blacks belong in America doesn't mean that he doesn't think that they're people.
That's right.
That's a different, because we're so used to this that we naturally think that Blacks belong here. It might be hard for him at that point to imagine, because he says it in the notes, there's sort of this wonder at the idea, or the notion that people who had been enslaved in the country could love the country. Yeah. Because he's basically saying, I wouldn't, if I were that, I wouldn't forgive, I wouldn't be doing that. And it's not a crazy notion, but I think it would have been hard for him to come to this idea, the Jefferson who existed at that particular moment, to think of all of us getting along and living in harmony together. But I do think with the Declaration, he's thinking about Anglo-American people and their future, the vision of what's going to be happening to them at that particular moment, not not the way we may have come to think about it. But the part about, I do think I really do wish that they had not taken that part of the Declaration out, even though everybody says that was ridiculous because it's a stupid statement. But to have a document, to have had a founding document where African Americans were recognized as people, as men, I think we could have used that too.
Yeah, I think you make a great point. And that is an unexpurgated original document of the Declaration actually gives us broader insights. On the one hand, it affirms Jefferson's emerging and developing ideas about race and nationhood, and we don't like them.
Yeah.
On the other hand, as Annette suggests, that's not all there is to this story, because he makes it clear that slavery is a radical injustice. And if there's a just God, he's not going to be on the side of the white Americans in the imagined race war that Jefferson evokes.
Good. So you've heard from a student from UMass, you've heard from one from Arizona State University. I want to see if we have a student. Let's get my colleague, April Langley. Do you have any students that have questions, April?
Yes, thanks for asking. Boy, I'm so honored to be here with all of these people who are talking about this amazing, amazing book and this work that is so absolutely necessary in this historical contemporary moment. My scholar is Deshaun McClinton, and I think he is on the line here, and he has a question from Mizzou. Deshaun? Scholar McClinton?
Hi, yes, I'm Deshaun McClinton. I'm a sophomore from Mizzou. And my question is just that when Jefferson began writing about his worries about slavery as an institution, do you think it was in any way motivated by a genuine moral concern, or was it entirely about practicality?
Entirely about what?
Practicality.
I think it was a moral concern. Jefferson was, to me, was a person from very early on who styled himself as an enlightened figure. And there were certain things, think of it like a liberal, certain tenets that people hold to, that make them a liberal, make them a progressive. And his attitude about religion, his attitude about inheritance, his attitude, about science, the importance of science, moving away from superstition to science, and anti-slavery. I mean, I talk about this in the Hemingses of Monticello when he's, I guess about 27 or 28, and the notation he makes in his memorandum books about a poem from William Shenstone about the slave trade, and the person ripped from their homeland to go and labor. I mean, he's not a public figure. He's not Thomas Jefferson at that point. Those are certain things that people who are enlightened believed. Now, whether or not they could actually live up to it, just like liberals, they live up to these things all the time is another. I don't want to pick on liberals, but I mean, conservatives tend to do a better job of sticking with their program than liberals do. But so I do think he saw it as a moral question. It wasn't a matter of practicality, because they would say the practical thing to do would be to hunker down and to, which is what most people did in the South, and kind of ride it out. But no, I do think it was a moral question for him. I don't think obviously he had strength is not the word I want to use. I mean, you could say it, to carry through with it. Or he actually thought in terms of freeing his own slaves, or to working to end slavery as an institution, overall, he had other stuff to do. I mean, we're talking about Jefferson and race and slavery. Those are things that interested him to some degree, and he writes a little bit about it, but Jefferson was obsessed about the revolution, and he was obsessed about the United States of America. And slavery, unfortunately, was something that he thought would solve itself. So I think he had moral qualms, but that was not at the top of his list of things to do. It was really about getting the United States started, and getting it into a strong or a viable position on the world stage.
I think, and that's exactly right. I think the easy mistake is to judge him by our own standard. And the biggest challenge is to imagine a moral imagination that is not ours, that is characteristic of its age. And I think Annette is right to invoke contemporaneous enlightened notions of moral philosophy, natural religion. Jefferson was not unusual in imbibing these ideas as a card-carrying member of the Republic of Letters. But again, agreeing with Annette in slightly different language, it's the hierarchy of commitments that fit into a broader worldview. That's what an ethical or moral horizon is. It's what needs to be done and how does it get done. And for Jefferson, the first order of business, and I think I want to emphasize this, he had deep misgivings about the old regime in Virginia. It was not an attractive place, and it was getting, in some ways, less and less attractive with the consolidation of large slaveholdings, with the kind of culture that it produced among the young men of Virginia, the cockfighting, hard drinking, honor-prone, vulgar consumer. Jefferson was somewhat appalled by his own class. He was a genuine reformer. But the threshold of reformation for him is the emergence of a civic community within which we can hope over the passage of time that there will be a progressive improvement, progressive enlightenment and refinement, that we will reach the point where we see collectively what needs to be done. And Jefferson imagines himself in a prophetic role, telling his fellow Virginians, here it is, here's the program. I'm not going to make myself feel better by freeing my slaves. He says, we have to free all of the slaves, which in other words, in practice means none of the slaves.
Yeah, because they're not going to do it.
So easy to say, Jefferson, this is so transparently self-serving. Well, in some ways, we all are self-serving, but the center of ourselves is a notion of ourselves as good people. Jefferson did not lose sleep at night because he was guilty, as we know he was. Jefferson's natural religion was more ameliorative. It was gradualist. It was based on the very thing that he thought he was living, which was enlightenment. The belief that ordinary people were capable of this enlightenment. Well, the Virginia elite didn't reform. The young men of Virginia turned out to be even worse than their fathers. And that was a dream. I'm exaggerating a little bit for rhetorical. But we can't begin to understand why Jefferson made the choices he made if we don't situate him in the world as he understood it. All of us have moral visions of the world, even as we serve ourselves and pursue our happiness. That's another fancy word for self-interest, of course.
Yeah. Hierarchy of commitment. I like that. We should use that. I'm sorry we didn't get that out
Next
beforehand. Next time.
All right. So, I'm watching time, so we don't have that much more time, but I want to see if there's anyone else out there who has a question. You can simply raise your hand. I know, Rudy, you had raised your hand. Did you want to go ahead and ask yours, and then we'll try and catch a couple more before time runs out? Rudy?
Sure. So Rudy Hernandez, I teach at Mizzou. I teach the Race of the American Story project. And I was thinking about your book and just sort of the comments you just made about situating Jefferson. And Jefferson has things he's against, and he seems to accomplish them. He's against monarchy. He's against primogeniture. He's against established religion. And he does things about all of those. And slavery seems to be the one area where he gives up on the project. He says, well, that's for future generations. And the one sort of story in the book that really struck me was he opens a nail factory. He goes to France. He's got to buy goods to look like a diplomat. He's got to fit out his house to look like he should and show us we're not, Americans aren't bumpkins. And I think he assumed he would get refunded those goods, and he wasn't, so he was broke. I kind of want to know about the meaning of opening that nail factory. Is that him completely giving up on ending slavery. That seems to be doubling down on his economic situation.
Okay. Yeah, he didn't. The nail factory. I'll throw a concept at you, Rudy, which I think might
Wasn't
help.
unmuted.
Oh,
No, I
you're
just
muted.
wasn't
Oh.
unmuted, but no, go ahead.
I'm going to just throw this out, and then you can run with it. And that is to say, when you think about slavery and freedom, that's black and white. In between slavery and freedom, if you know nothing's going to happen today, but maybe tomorrow or someday in the future, then you adjust to that grayness, fogginess. And the key word I want to throw out is amelioration. Now, it's hard for us to imagine that a nail factory would be like a school, would be a place where notions of order and productivity were internalized, where work would be a good thing. It seems to us just to be a crude example of finding some way to exploit the kids. And it was. There's no way that you can impose, I mean, in his ethical worldview, this is what he's doing in the interests of his household now. That is to sustain it and its autonomy, because of course, if the household fails, the plantation fails, then you might have to liquidate your slave property holdings. So I don't mean this at all really as apologetics. I don't think Jefferson, I think he just, what? No, this is not the solution, but it's what I'm doing now in managing my household for what I imagine to be the collective welfare of my family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's entirely, it's not a blow against slavery. It's amelioration, and it's an experiment. And it was an experiment, and management through incentive. I mean, the sort of crazy notion that if you pay people, they work better, they want to work better. You know, you pay them in money, pay them in clothes, pay them in food, pay them in things, and you get them to do stuff. And that was, and all of those people, actually Senator Stanton has written about this more eloquently than we did. All of those people who worked there, the ones who did well ended up doing things, become the foreman of the nail of the blacksmith shop, or one of them becomes his personal valet. Pardon me. The 10. Yeah, I mean, within the context of slavery. Yeah. So no, I mean, I think your point where you're going with this at the beginning, I think is exactly right. That is a question. Why is it that this particular thing, these other things bothered him, and he really went at it? Slavery, you know, he introduces as a young man some sort of bill for emancipation, and it doesn't go anywhere, and he gives up, you know, essentially after that. And he looks around and makes the decision that people in Virginia, the only kind of solution to slavery in Virginia had to be a Republican solution. That is to say, white people had to vote this out. And if he knew, at some point he determines this is not going to happen. They're not going to vote slavery out. There's not going to be a legislative solution. The only thing that the way slavery is going to end in Virginia was the way it ended. And that is not something that he would have said, we're going to go to war and end this. He knew his people, and he knew that this is not going anywhere. And I think that's really what it is. And he turned, as I said before, to focus on the stuff that he was more obsessed about. He wasn't willing to go down in flames that would make us look better. He would look better to us if he were to have done that, to the extent that we would have remembered him. But if he had said, you know, forget it all, I'm not going to be Secretary of State, I'm not going to be Vice President, I'm not going to be President, I'm going to devote my life to ending slavery, he would be like in one of those sidebars in textbooks, you know, where that has the information that they really don't want to talk about in the main text, but it's kind of over here. That's what he would have been. And that was not, I think he saw himself as a man of destiny who would have a legacy, And he was very much about, well, doing the things that, number one, he really wanted to do, and doing things in a way that would have us sitting here talking about him. And he'd be like Richard Randolph. There are all these people who did things at the time who were thought of as crazy and were marginalized. He wasn't going to the margins.
Right. He couldn't do anything that was important to him without other people doing it with him. He's not going to be the commander who's going to tell people what to do. I think another dimension of that's very important. Things which were beyond his control, because they were in effect predicated on what the people of Virginia collectively are prepared to do. I think it's really important that he has a study that's insulated, isolated. It's a place where he goes and thinks about things, he reads, he even prays. He comes up with these crazy ideas about Unitarianism, but he doesn't want anybody to know about it. His sense of self, his privacy, the autonomy of the Jefferson who has faith in the future and who prays as he tells his emancipating neighbor, I hope, I pray, he says to Edward Coles, that slavery will end one day. But this is not, and Coles says, well, make a speech, go out there, enough of your prayers. He doesn't say that, but go out and do something. Use your capital. Mm-hmm. Use your capital to play the game of politics. And Jefferson would say, no. I've let my ideas, people know what I think is the solution. I'm waiting for the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And you can wait a long time for an enlightenment, as we're waiting for it.
We're still waiting now. Yeah, no, it's true. And it just did, those were not the things. I think the hierarchy of commitment, I really like that phrase, by the way. I'm going to steal it.
You have it.
Yeah, I mean, that these are, they interest us, and rightly so. But that was not what he thought he felt that he was put here to do. I mean, he could tell you that slavery was evil and it should end, and we should set up a different kind of society. But what interested him was the United States. We created a country, and I was part of that. And this is a big deal. We got rid of a king, and we set this thing up. Now for the next generation of people, you do your thing. But this is what we did, and that's, I mean, up until his dying day, he's still fighting in some ways old battles. Those old political battles that are long gone. He's still off in there thinking that he thought this was the most important thing that had happened in modern history, the creation of the United States. Well, and we take it for granted, but
Yeah. Right. And what did Lincoln say? Lincoln said, we saved it. And he honored Jefferson. Mm-hmm. For having been the author of the Declaration, having started it. Now we stroke our chins and say, really? Something different is going on here. But saving the Union, that was the framework within which Lincoln imagined that government for the people and by the people could find take its moral bearings and do the right thing.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Lincoln is somebody we discuss, I think 2 weeks after we discuss Jefferson, 2 or 3 weeks after. So we're seeing how all these people are threaded together throughout American history, and of course how they deal with the issue of race that is still dogging us now. So, I'm looking at the time. We could talk for another 2 hours, I know, but
fast.
I know it's gone too fast, and our students actually have many more questions. So maybe we'll catch you next year, and
that would be lovely.
See what else you have written since now. I want to just let everybody know that we have 3 more sessions this month for Race and the American Story. Race and American Sports is April 17th. Race and American Music is April 18th. And then we will be discussing the James Baldwin, William Buckley debate on race on April 28th. Yes, and we'll have experts on each of those days. So please come back and join us. what do you think about what we've just done? Please let us know at raceandtheamericanstory@gmail.com so that we can pull all the feedback together and use it to argue for more funding for these really interesting and very important conversations. I want to thank Peter and Annette for joining us. You've been so generous with your time and they were with us last week also and spent 90 minutes with us last week. So just really appreciative of you and your talents and your time. And I will kick it over to Adam.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'll just say also, thank you all so much for being here. Peter and Annette, especially a big thank you to both of you. Really happy to see everyone here. And please do join us for the rest of our Zoomposium events that Stephanie mentioned. Look at our website, raceandtheamericanstory.org. I chatted out the schedule, link to the schedule of the rest of the events. So please take a look at that, and please do send us feedback as well. And just thank you all so much again for being here. Please stay healthy and well, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.